So, guys, let's go back to Lady Hope's biography of Sir Arthur Cotton. ஆர்த்தர் காட்டன் பற்றி எல்லாருக்கும் தெரிஞ்சிருக்கும்னு நினைக்கிறேன். தஞ்சாவூர் டெல்டாவில் கெனால் சிஸ்டமாக எக்ஸ்டென்சிவாக ரீடிசைன் பண்ணினவர், புது கல்லணையை கட்டினவர், கல்லணையை புதுப்பித்தவர். அண்ட் கல்லணையோட மாடலில் கோதாவரி நதி மேலே தவளேஸ்வரம் அணைக்கட்டு கட்டினவர். ஓகே, ஸோ பேஜ் 61 வரைக்கும் பார்த்தோம். நவ் 62, பேஜ் 62லேருந்து இப்போ பார்க்க போகிறோம். ஸோ லெட்ஸ் see, is it there? What the hell? ఏమ్మా దోశ అంతా తిన్నామే, ఇంకా గంట సేపు తాను తిందామా? అవును, నీకు ఆకలిగా ఉందా? తినేదైతే ఇలా గంట సేపు కాలుస్తా. ఆ తలుపు బాగా టైట్గా వేయాలి. నువ్వు okay guys, there we go. Okay guys, there we go. Okay. Page 62. Indeed, from this time, his active brain and earnest mind were ever at work, planning and scheming new enterprises, and always on a scale which was in accord with the size and volume of the rivers in question and the tracts of country which surrounded them. To these districts, these huge forces of water must necessarily, in flood times, be an engine of destruction, or in drought, if not used, a loss which could only cause famine, poverty, disease, and death. On the other hand, they could be made productive of unlimited blessing and prosperity. It was among the essential principles always insisted upon by him that the value of the irrigation works was not to be measured simply by the additional revenue yielded to the government treasury, but that a much truer criterion is found in the enhancement of their income to the people and in the consequent saleable value of the land itself. Hence the importance of the observations which follow. As to the profits of the people, he remarked in a letter to the Board of Revenue dated December 13th, 1837, the year after the completion of the weirs, when noticing the increase of the revenue. I believe the increase in the value of property to individuals is also at least proportionally great. In Trichinopoly, I have ascertained that the value of the lands in Seringam has actually doubled, and I am informed that the same is the case in the two South Arcot Tolics. In Tanjore also, I am assured that the price of land has greatly increased. So, when it is considered that as much as 560,000 kanis of land are affected by the anicuts, the saleable price of which is perhaps 8 million pounds, it does not seem too much to suppose that they have been the means of causing an increase of private property to the extent of no less a sum than 500,000 pounds. To re-quote the remark on an earlier page of this chapter, He who makes two blades of grass to grow where one grew before is a benefactor of his species. An extract from a letter from the Board of Revenue written 10 years after the construction of the Anicuts, stating what was then officially known of their general results, may help to a reply. Among the years succeeding 1836, some have been very bad and others equally good. But it is remarkable how uniform the rate of increase of production has continued, proving very clearly that the Anicut has laid a new foundation of prosperity so far as that may be measured by the productive power of the land. No other instrument could be employed to obtain the same results because no other would tend in anything like the same degree to equalize the effects of favorable and unfavorable seasons, which are in themselves beyond any control. The official figures showing the progress recorded 15 and 14 years respectively after commencement are: Upper Coleraine Anicut, first cost 8,340 pounds. Subsequent repairs 27,238 pounds. Number of years 15. Aggregate net increase of revenue 208,291 pounds. Average annual profit 12,702 pounds. Aggregate profit 172,713 pounds. Annual percentage of profit on first cost 144 and 11 out of 16, that is 144.11 parts in 16. Lower Coleraine Anicut, first cost 74,231 pounds. Subsequent repairs 3,997 pounds. Number of years 14. Aggregate net increase of revenue 14,230 pounds. Average annual profit 9,879 pounds. Aggregate profit 130,876 pounds. Annual percentage of profit on first cost 133 and 1 part in 16. The late General Bell, RE, that is probably Royal Engineers, states that the cost was greatly diminished owing to a singular circumstance. The stone for the upper Anicut was carried near the site of the works, but no such resource being available within a long distance from the lower Anicut, all the required stone, with of course the consent of the Brahmins, was procured from the boundary wall of an ancient temple standing in the jungle not far off and long since disused. Page 64. The profits were reckoned on the original outlay on the anicuts, which were the basis of the whole system of irrigation, reforming it in 1 year with, as has been shown, almost magical effect. All the outlay for 15 years under the head of subsequent repairs, but including many new subsidiary works, was compared with the former outlay for the same number of years for repairs and found to be considerably less, proving that the Anicut had not only provided water for irrigation, but with its subsidiary works had rendered the management of the river less expensive. The saving in this respect was, therefore, added legitimately to the profit on the works. On this point, an extract from a minute by the Honorable John Sullivan, Member of Council, dated September 5, 1840, is explicit and valuable. It is satisfactory to know that after some of the heaviest freshets that have ever been known in the Kaveri, no damage whatever has been done to the banks of either river. On the contrary, the civil engineer reports that Tanjore was never so free from breaches as it has been this year. The principal collector of Tanjore wrote to the Board of Revenue on August 11, 1838 as follows: I trust the board will be satisfied from what has been said that the season of firstly 1246 AD 1836 was beyond all comparison worse than that of firstly 1241, both as regards the freshes and the rains. But as long as there was water for it to act upon, the effects of the anicut were most satisfactory, and the inference was on and the inference was not only fair but obvious, and that when, as was the case after the 25th September, the failure of the supply in the Agunda Kaveri, or sorry, the failure of the supply in the Aganda Kaveri was so great as to never afford a full river for a single day, even with the assistance of the Anicut. Without it, the failure of the crops must have been incalculably greater than it was. I cannot conclude without observing that while so much doubt appears to be entertained of the advantages of the anicut elsewhere, there is not an individual in the province who does not consider it the greatest blessing that has ever been conferred upon it. The almost phenomenal activity of my father's mind, to be noted again and again in this biography, was probably never more strikingly manifested than at this time. To turn the flowing current of a large tropical river with little of experience to guide one might have been supposed to be enough to occupy the mind of a young man still considerably under 30. Not so, thought Arthur Cotton. A suggestion was made that the roadstead of Madras should be formed into an enclosed harbour, or at least a breakwater or breakwaters should be provided. Merchants and others interested in the seaborne trade of the presidency, hearing of his Pamban passage work and of his interest in everything which made water subservient to the purposes of man, invited his opinions. He complied with their request and briefly urged: first, that the work best calculated to counteract the surf should be unconnected with the shore. Second, that its shape should be a straight line parallel with the coast. Third, that it should be of rough stone. Fourth, that it should be, sorry, fourth, that it should not be within nor much beyond the outer line of the surf. Colonel D. Haviland, the commandant of engineers at Madras, approved of Captain Cotton's project and praised it highly, but the idea of such a breakwater was eventually relinquished, although at the time so greatly did it commend itself to the gentleman who had taken up the scheme that at one meeting a very large sum of money was subscribed with the intention of carrying out the plans. On December 13, 1837, Captain Cotton addressed to the Board of Revenue an elaborate report on the duties of the Irrigation Department as a whole, but especially in relation to the numerous tanks referred to by Burke in the passage quoted on a preceding page. In this, he treated first of the value of the works belonging to the tank department, not merely their capital value as enterprises, but their annual value to the country if kept in good order. And then of the sum of money absolutely necessary every year by year for this purpose. As to the then annual value, he shewed that it had greatly fallen off through want of attention. In conclusion, he remarked that were these works all efficient, the annual value of the dependent crop would be augmented from its then value, pound 3.2 millions, to pounds 4.13 millions, and the annual revenue from 1.18 million pounds to 1.65 million pounds. There is, in almost every district in the Madras Presidency, an immense number of tanks constructed to catch the rainfall and conserve it for irrigational purposes. Most, if not all of these, are of Indian origin. A vast proportion has been allowed to fall into disrepair, their beds being used in parts for the growing of crops instead of their whole area utilized for the storage of water. An example of this will at once occur to everyone who knows the city of Madras. In the magnificent but unused area of the Mylapore tank, which runs by the side of the splendid road to St. Thomas Mount and is a boundary to the many mansioned townlet of Nungambakam. These, says the Honorable A. Deacon, MLA, one of the delegates to England in 1900, in connection with the Commonwealth Bill, in his valuable work on Irrigated India, are all sizes according to the catchment and serve for the watering of an immense area. Nowhere else in India is there such a multiplication of minor storages. Mr. Deakin further remarks, a calculation has been in circulation for some years in which it is estimated that if the embankments constructed with this end within the presidency were added together, they would make a wall of earth 6 feet high, 1.5 times around the globe. Arthur Cotton's next work was the superintendence of the construction of a short railway from Madras to the Red Hills, a few miles distant, intended for the transport of red material to the city. At this spot is now situated the reservoir which supplies the city of Madras with water. Circumstances arose which prevented the completion of the line, but it afforded practical experience which was of considerable use to him in the execution of the Godavari works years after, where railway lines played an important part in facilitating the prompt construction of the great dams. In a report which he prepared about this time, he discussed the great sorry. In a report which he prepared about this time, he discussed the question of railways relatively to improved common roads and makes mention of the short line between Madras and the Red Hills in illustration of his views. He had evidently no full conception then of the noble scheme of waterways for irrigation and transport, which a few years afterwards he brought before the government and the public, and of which he never ceased to be a zealous advocate. In the light of the knowledge he then possessed, he set himself to prove the advantage of railways over the best roads, as he afterwards proved the superiority of steamboat canals to railways. There was thus no inconsistency in his ideas and writings. Quite a stretch of logic, because he supported Red Hills Railways in 1840s, 30 sometime. It doesn't mean he was impartial in supporting canals in 1850s, 60s. Very subtle sleight of hand by Lady Hope. The one problem always before him was the cheapest and most serviceable transport for India, and to his subsequent solution of the same, he, for more than 40 years, adhered with inviolable fidelity. Major General Fred C. Cotton, the sole surviving brother of my father, has favored me with some notes on the subjects last mentioned. The Riddles Railway, he says, was the first railway made in India, and the idea that my brother was opposed to a railway system being begun in India was incorrect. Later, he came to feel that when once large capital was expended on railways, there would be no chance of country having the cheaper water carriage, which was and ever would be less costly for the transport of its products over the great distance they would require to be moved. In this, he was quite right, and no one can doubt the value to India of a means of transport that would enable the producer, for instance, to undersell his competitors in the markets of other countries. Sir Arthur's expectations as to the fitness of canal carriage seem never to have been rightly understood in England, perhaps because the canal system in this country is on so small a scale. The canals and river navigation of India, as he would have it, would have admitted of steam being used as the locomotive power in impelling vessels of great tonnage, which the size of the rivers and the cheapness of land for canalization promised in every way. And as has been found, the very limited amount of tonnage even a costly railway can deal with makes them quite insufficient in power for the object he had in view and the real requirements of the country. I only write this note because it appears to me that some explanation is advisable of Sir Arthur's opposition to the costly railway system being adopted, to the exclusion of the infinitely more economical and more suitable carriage by water. And I would add to these that when it was determined, contrary to the advice of the late Lord Derby, at that time Lord Stanley, somewhile Secretary of State for India, to establish railways on the British system in India, every requisite for the purpose was immediately supplied. Unlimited capital, qualified engineers in any number, rails, coaches, wagons, and locomotives needed only to be asked for to be forthwith supplied. The land, instead of being obtained through the expensive process of a parliamentary committee, was provided directly by a decree of the government. And lastly, the necessary surveys were conducted with scarcely any difficulty through vast tracts of mostly level country. The broad rivers were entirely novel features, but these had, in many instances, been bridged by the Indian engineers, whose methods of construction were patterns of value to all future builders. On the other hand, a system of canal navigation would have required long and patient investigation and elaborate surveys by engineers accustomed to the construction and management of hydraulic works, and of such engineers, very few then existed. It was no wonder then that if such a system were thought of at all, it was rejected in favor of one perfectly easy of conception and execution, and needing only a guarantee to establish it all over the country. End of quote. End of page 69. End of chapter. So before we go to the next chapter, that is chapter 5, we'll close chapter 4 here. So from what page to what page did I read? Close. This is Act 4, 169. Okay, let's say it is 169. From what page did I begin? Captain Cotton. 169. Where was it? Okay, 62. 62 to 68. Rename. Let us see whether the YouTube live is still there. Okay, it is there. It is there. Fine. Let us go back to the page 70, chapter 5. Preparing for the great work, the redemption of the Godavari district. Oh. The bursting at Hobart Town of the boiler attached to the rotatory engine invented by Captain Cotton, with the resulting injury to himself, left alike its mark and influence upon him. When he reached Madras, he found himself in so unsatisfactory a state of health as to shrink from the heavy toil of an engineer in charge of a division. To him, this was a serious disappointment. The long leave in Australia had afforded time for a consolidation of personal character and a great growth of mental force and professional zeal and acumen. India had taken hold of him, not the India of romance, but the India in need. Consequently, it was with sorrow he felt himself unable to undertake what he wished to do. Arthur Cotton could afford to accept events with equanimity. He knew he was in God's hands and was satisfied that, in his good time, the way would be made clear. Weekend health necessitated light work, and light work was ready for him. It was therefore of signal benefit to himself as well as to that part of the Madras presidency in which his service was to be performed that he was appointed to superintend the building of a church at Visagapatam and also the construction of groins on the beach at that place. Vizag, as it is familiarly called, was one of the most pleasant and salubrious stations in the northern districts. Here he had a veritable tryst which well prepared him for the engineering labors which were to surpass all that he had as yet performed. On their way from Madras to Visagapatam, the party had a direful experience. A cyclone burst in the Bay of Bengal, having, as is the wont of these circular storms, worked its way from that birthplace of the winds in the neighborhood of the Andaman Islands, whence have come so many destructive storms to devastate the bay and to work havoc on the shores of northern Madras and Orissa. Of his voyage, my mother writes. We left Madras for Visakhapatnam, the sky all over clouded with the tokens of a hurricane coming on, and before we had been on board many hours, the hurricane burst in all its fury. It was a remarkable voyage on account of the captain's wonderful presence of mind during the whole time the storm was raging. He behaved in a most Christian manner. No angry word was heard throughout the storm, nothing but his voice shouting through a speaking trumpet his orders to the officers. Everything else was as quiet as possible. When the hurricane ceased, we found that the ship which had sailed from Madras at the same time as he had disappeared. The next morning, the sea was strewn with wreckage, and a dismasted vessel was a striking object close by. The captain assembled all the crew and passengers and thanked God for their deliverance. But the strain had been too great. His mind gave way immediately afterwards, and it was some time before he brought us into Visakhapatnam. Nowadays, the warning cone on Madras beach would have told of the coming peril, and on the beginning of the voyage would no doubt have been delayed. Few who have not witnessed a bay cyclone can conceive the widespread destruction often caused. In 1872, one such storm burst upon the then unprotected roadstead of Madras. The violence of the wind increased as night came on and blew with terrific fury throughout the hours of darkness, causing much devastation. When day broke, such a scene of wreckage was revealed as had never before been known. Several vessels, some English, some Indian coasting ships, were strewn along 3 miles of coast, while the iron pier, stretching a long distance through the surf to deep water, had been cut in two by an Indian ship, which had been driven clean through the structure and wrecked on the opposite side. A bay cyclone exhibits nature in one of her most fearsome moods. The party arrived safely at Vijagapatam and were not long in finding a rough dwelling on the top of an isolated hill called the Dolphin's Nose. Some disused artillery barracks were found of use. 2 years were spent in the pleasingly diversified duties of building a church at Voltaire and protecting the beach with groins and other consolidating works. My father describes his early work there as the construction of a series of groins at certain distances. These were built of large stone blocks, unhewn and piled above the highest water mark for some 50 yards out to sea. Often, in later years, when he was visiting English harbors, he would talk over this simple and yet most efficient method of resisting the force of the waves and even proving an effective barrier against a heavy surf, such as that which ever breaks upon the Indian coast. He has told us how, in those early days, he was ridiculed by older men who were more learned engineers. To suppose for a moment that piles of rough, loose stones thrown together could possibly resist the encroachments of such a sea. It was ridiculous. However, his groins proved a grand success. They did their work, which was all that was wanted of them. Nay, they did more than was expected, for they made a splendid beach and added to the available soil by the silting of the sand above them. A first-rate beach, he would say, with one of his earnest, impressive gestures when talking it over in later years. My mother says of the experiences of that time. The view from the dolphin's nose was very fine. The hill rose the hill rose abruptly from the sea, and the great depth looked down upon from the top was sometimes awe-inspiring. Hawks and other large birds of prey above wheeled sorry hawks and other large birds of prey above wheeled ceaselessly in circles, uttering their wild, weird cry. One house only beside the barrack was on the hill. The chaplain of Visakhapatnam had built it and lived there, an agreeable companion and friend who often spent the evenings in our society, frequently in studying prophecy together. As bearing in some degree on what Sir Henry, sorry, as bearing in some degree on what Sir Henry Sumner Maine, distinguished among the eminent jurists who have served India as legal members of the Governor General's Council, has discussed in his address the influence of India upon English thought. This may not be an inconvenient place in which to make a remark on the effect of the solitary or semi solitary existence in which so many Anglo Indian officials perforce spend most of their time upon those who pass through this experience. India has produced a special kind of British Christian, the Lawrences, the Edwardeses, whose biographies have delighted and profited many thousands of God fearing folk, are representative of a very large proportion of Anglo Indian residents. A convinced British Christian in India and Ceylon becomes a man or woman of intense conviction, of close study of the Bible, of more than average earnestness of life. Arthur Cotton was one of the most conspicuous of these unostentatious but deeply faithful and conscientious followers of the Savior. To the very religious mind and mood of the Hindu, the character of such an appeals with great force. General Randall, Royal Engineers, an old colleague of my father, brings this out with great force when he remarks, his character, as known to a large circle of friends, was that of a truly humble and consistent Christian with deep and earnest religious convictions which dominated his whole life and which led him always to commit all his undertakings to God, in whom he believed and trusted. Utterly unselfish and brimful of kindness to others, especially to the many young men who had the privilege of serving under him, ever considerate to the natives of India, who almost worshipped him for his self denying labor in their behalf, and amongst whom he was known as the sannyasi or devotee, he gained an influence over those brought in contact with him, which with many remained throughout their life. Goodness, my voice is breaking. Oh, first time I have become emotional while reading this book at page 74. Sorry, let me take a minute to recover. One stormy afternoon, when my father was returning from the beach works, the wind was so boisterous he could hardly keep his feet. He saw a small native vessel being driven in against the rocks. The men on board were evidently helpless, and already a troop of wreckers had collected and were watching for their prey. He hurried to the spot and rushed on board the boat, with his stick driving back the greedy crowd and defending the master and sailors. The vessel was loaded with coconuts, and many of these were stolen, but he managed to stand his ground till his sergeant came up, and the two men cleared the deck and delivered the overpowered crew from their foes. They also saved the little hoard of money, about 200 rupees, which the wreckers would soon have found. He provided a shelter for them that night, and the next morning they all came up to the house, prostrated themselves, and poured out evident thanks in a language which none of us understood. Oh goodness, tears bubbling in my eyes now. Uh, One is flowing down the left cheek. I'm very sorry, very sorry. Sorry, guys. I'm actually reading this book nearly after 5 years. I think I read this book sometime in 2018. No, sorry, 2019. After Kerala floods. After Kerala floods in 2019, our uh, my area tank got dried, and that time I remember taking my ex-wife into the center of the lake and showing her around in 2019. And during that time, I because I realized that even our own tank can dry up so much, I began reading this work about cotton, and then I digitized it in 2019, early months, that is in January, February 2019. So after that, I don't remember reading this book again. So because it has been 5 years, I had totally forgotten what was written in that book by now. So I'm becoming quite emotional reading it. Of Visakhapatnam, my father, in later years, at a time when he was planning a large project, nothing less than the making of that port, one of the principal entrances to India, wrote thus: First, Visakhapatnam is the only place on the eastern coast of India where there is no severe heat. Second, it has the best climate in India. Third, it is the natural point of outlet for all northern India by a direct railway to Allahabad, making it the cheapest and safest line from England to the north of India. Fourth, it has the point of the eastern coast where, incomparably, the best harbour can be made by a single breakwater run out from the bold promontory of the Dolphin's Nose, south of the town. The adjoining territory provides an exceptional site for a first class city. The whole tract from Visakhapatnam to Ratipur, 300 miles, is the most fertile part of India. It rises to 2000 feet and is suited to every kind of European enterprise: the planting of coffee, sugar, culture of the wine, and fruit trees generally. There is hill country with a temperate climate south of Raripur, and also the central provinces of India rising to 3000 feet. A beautiful country with a temperature down to frost in winter. Eighth, water communication can be completed with the Punjab by the valley of the Ganges and the coast to Visakhapatnam. The same to the great navigations of the delta of the Godavari and Krishna, also to Madras. By the Godavari to Berar, uniting the Punjab, the upper Brahmaputra, Nagpur, and Madras in a first class navigation of at least 10,000 miles, providing all North and East India with transit at one tenth the cost of railways. 3 or 4,000 miles of these canals are ready in operation. Ninth, the line between Ruripur and Allahabad passes through a field containing the best coal in India. 10th, inland of the town site is an extensive piece of alluvial land level with the sea, which can be cheaply made into an immense inner harbour. The outer harbour can be formed by blocks of granite of any size from the Dolphin's Nose, costing nothing but the powder, loading carriage by boats a few hundred yards, and discharging. This was a noble scheme. What would have been the result had my father been given a free hand and been backed up at headquarters, especially in the India office? Arthur Cotton, had he had his own way, would have more than half regenerated India. It was while engaged in this reclamatory work at Visakhapatnam that he first became acquainted with the great Godavari river, which afterwards was to be the scene of his most toilsome labors, his keenest anxieties, and his grandest success. Mm, okay, live stream. Okay, legend Kannadasan. ஆகவே போர் புரிக ஆசான். What? What the hell is that? ஆகவே போர் புரிகவா ஆசானா? Guys, let me close this right now. I will go and have a bath and then I'll come back and